right, good evening. It's time for us to go ahead and jump back into our Sunday evening through the Bible study that we've been doing. I do want to reiterate that this is not a book-by-book study of the Old Testament or of the Bible. We're not following the flow of the books as they're written, although, as you go through the history books, it's kind of going to be what's going to happen. We're following the chronological timeline. We're following the story. And so we have the beginning of the story. And where does the story begin? In the beginning, right? And we don't have a date or anything like that to put onto creation. That's a really weird R. Hold on. In fact, really, through most of what's called the primeval history for Israel, chapters 1 through 11, Genesis 1 through 11, I don't put dates on any of it. It's not necessary. I don't even find it helpful to do so. And it avoids discussions that just are not necessary discussions to take place. And so I don't worry about dating until we get to Genesis chapter 12, when we're a lot more certain as far as dates are concerned. As we get to what man in Genesis chapter 12? All right, this is where Abraham comes on to the scene. And at that time, we're looking roughly 2100 or so BC. What events transpire between creation and Abraham? What's that? Okay, before the Tower of Babel. Okay, Genesis chapter 3 and the fall is one of the most important, in fact, I might even, if I were to make a list of key passages of the Old Testament, I might even include that as the first key passage of the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 3, which talks about the fall, where the Edenic paradise is now lost, and they are outside of Eden, and now they are in a different world. So Genesis chapter 3 is the first of the key passages. Then you have the flood account. Obviously you have Cain and Abel, that's part of the Genesis 3 story, Genesis 3 and 4 together. Then you have the genealogy in 5, 6 through 9 is the Noah story and the flood. And then after that, you have some more genealogies and such. Elijah mentioned Babel, which is in here in chapter 11. And then we get to chapter 12, where Abraham comes onto the scene. At this point, we've had two separate times in which God has taken a specific man and instituted a covenant. But in both of those instances, it was only that man and his wife. There were the sons of Noah, but it was given to just these people, whether it be Genesis 1 and 2 or Genesis chapter 9. It's different in chapter 12 when he singles out a certain individual and he says he makes the covenant with him. It's not that he's the only person who's there. He is singled out as one of many people who are there. Do you see the difference between Genesis 12 and then Genesis 9 and Genesis 1 and 2? So Abraham, this is where God now selects one man who's going to become one nation. So Genesis chapter 12 becomes the second key passage in which God gives promises. What are the three main promises that we focus on? Yeah, very good. All right, very good. In case you didn't hear Samuel, land, nation, and seed. He promises that they are going to become a great nation, that the nation would be given a specific land, and through them, or through his seed, all the nations or families of the earth would be blessed. All right, so that's in Genesis chapter 12. As you continue the timeline, really the next major date is one that's actually under a lot of discussion. There are two options for it. But what is the next major event that we date? Anybody? The Exodus, yeah. And there are two dates that are generally understood. It's either one or the other. You put the Exodus. I happen to think it's in the 450 time range. Other people believe that it's in the 1250 time range. There are arguments, good arguments on both sides of that. I'm not dogmatic on this, but I think the 1450 date makes a whole lot more sense than the 1250 date. But it goes either way. This is what we have been spending our time on over the last few times. Obviously, between Abraham and the Exodus, we have Abraham's son. Who's that? Isaac. Isaac's son, Jacob. And then we have Jacob's numerous sons who eventually, through whose story do they come down to Egypt? All right, through Joseph's story, his narrative, they come down to Egypt, at which point they spread, and then they become enslaved. Yeah, they become slaves in Egypt. That's what prompts the Exodus in approximately 1450, I think, 1450 BC. So, as they are brought out, what does God use to bring them out? All right, plagues. How many? All right, there are 10 plagues, and it culminates. The very final one is which one? All right, the death of the firstborn in all the land of Egypt, except for those who what? All right, except for the ones who followed the very specific procedure to put blood on the doorpost, the lintel. We talked about it a little bit this morning in the sermon. This is what we call the Passover. So this is where the Passover festival comes in. They are brought out of Egypt. They're brought across the Red Sea. In what way? All right, they're brought across a huge body of water, but the body of water is dry ground for them. This is a huge, miraculous event. So they're able to come across on dry ground. When the Egyptians try to follow, what happens to them? They die. The waters come in and they all drown. So they are brought out with the mighty hand. God leads them to what mountain? All right, Mount Sinai, which is where he displays himself on the mountain. He speaks to them what famous words? Yeah, the 10 Commandments, right? Or literally the 10 words. I mean, that's what it's called, the 10 words, the Decalogue, if you've heard that phrase, the 10 Commandments. They're given, and then that, Exodus 20, 21, 22, 23, culminate in chapter 24, where what happens? That's where they enter into a covenant. So, Exodus chapter 24, which is now the third key passage of the Old Testament. This is where they enter into a covenant. Remember, they took the blood, they sprinkled half the blood on the people, half the blood on the altar, and in this way they signed their contract together with God. They are no longer just a group of people with the same daddy, granddaddy up the line. They are now a nation of God's people, and they have accepted him. He calls them in Exodus 19, what does he call them? A kingdom of priests and a holy nation, right? That they serve as a priesthood before all of the other people, the other nations. All right. So this then, you move forward just a little bit, and we can also, I guess, put it at this same timeline. What other major event takes place basically around this same time? As God gives them the law, they build the tabernacle, he gives them various rights of priesthood and various things, and then he says, okay, it's time now to do what? Yeah, Kathy? Well, they've built the tabernacle. Yeah, because that was the very next thing after chapter 24 that they do. So they build the tabernacle. We go through, we get the rights of the priesthood and holiness and Leviticus, Day of Atonement, all of that. You get into Numbers, and God says, okay, it's time to do what now? It's time for us to go take the land. And what did the people say? They said, no, it's not. We're not going to do it. We would rather do what? We'd rather die in the wilderness than go up into the land. So what did God say? Okay, if you'd rather die in the wilderness, you'll die in the wilderness, and your kids will go up into the land. So that was Numbers chapters 13 and 14 that we talked about last time. And then we ended with them as they have... Anyway, this is horribly not to scale. This is probably goes further up here. That's even worse. You know what? Forget it. They're down here. This is the Sinai Peninsula right here. So they're in the Sinai Peninsula. They come up to a place called Kadesh Barnea, and they make their way around, and they come up to this area right here. What's that called? Yeah, this is the plains of Moab, where there is a mountain approximately right here or so. What is that mountain? Mount Nebo. What's special about Mount Nebo? All right, this is where Moses is allowed to go up, see the land, even though he's not allowed to go into it, and it's where he dies. It's on the plains of Moab that Moses delivers his final address to the people. What do we call that final address? It's really a series of about 5 addresses, really, but this is Deuteronomy. What does the word Deuteronomy mean? Second law. And so this is the second time that the law is being given to them. This has a lot of the same laws that you had before, but it also has some differences. Why would it have some different laws in it? Okay, a different people. All right. Okay, because they're at a different point now, right? All the laws that were given down here in Sinai were preparatory, but as they are now about ready to cross the river and go into the land itself, there's more that's given, such as Deuteronomy chapter 17 and the laws of the king. It says, hey, when you get in there and you say, I want a king like all the other nations, that's great. Here's how to do it, right? You find that in Deuteronomy chapter 17. And you have various laws like that that are all about what they're going to do when they get into the land specifically that weren't as important down here when they were just at Sinai. So you see that with the second telling. It ends in the midst of this Deuteronomy chapter 18. I don't think we mentioned this, but it's an important part where Moses, knowing that he's going to die, he tells them what's going to happen. Anybody familiar with Deuteronomy chapter 18, the importance of that chapter? Yeah. Yeah, exactly, Lorraine. He says that God's going to raise up another like me. You're not going to be left without any kind of a help. Don't worry. There will be another. And it's important that we see that, because at the end of Deuteronomy, it gives us a little note, or at the end of really some of these sections, it tells us that hasn't happened yet. They still don't have the one who is just like Moses, who has a face-to-face connection, deep connection with God, the way that Moses does. But are they going to get a new leader to lead them? Yes. Who is that? All right, Joshua. And with that, we turn the page from Deuteronomy and we move forward in the story, and we come to the story of Joshua. So here is this great people. We know from Deuteronomy that they have conquered some of the kings that are over on this side of the Jordan. And so they're here. You know, there were kings up in here who tried to defy them and say, we're going to stand in your way. And they said, well, you can try, but you don't really want to stand in God's way. And they went in there and obliterated them. So they have taken land over on this side across the Jordan, or the Transjordan area. And so now they are sitting here on the plains of Moab, and they are ready to move into the land. This brings us to the very beginning of Joshua. Joshua takes control, and by the way, because this is a synopsis, we're going to leave stuff out. I mean, that's just naturally the way that it's going to be. And so there are going to be some details that you're going to be like, well, wait, we never said, yeah, that's kind of the nature of the beast. If for some reason that you feel like there's a detail that, really needs to be brought out, I'm overlooking something, by all means, bring it up. That's fine. I'm not saying that the details that I bring out are the only ones that matter. But initially, as they are here, there is a city over on the other side that is kind of a formidable city. What city is that? All right, so you have the city of Jericho. What do you know about Jericho? All right, it's got a really solid wall. This is the type of fortified city that the spies 40 years before had talked about. And they said they have fortified cities that are impossible for us to get through. The walls are impenetrable. There's no way we can do this. This is one of those. It most likely is a military city, and it's kind of here to be a protection for the areas that are around it. Therefore, it's most likely mostly military. It's not going to be comprised of necessarily a lot of families. It's not a sprawling, typical family city that we generally would think of. It is a military stronghold, outpost, and it's heavily fortified, very strong walls, and this is the destination that they're told to go and seek first. We know the story. A couple spies are sent in. Who helps them? Rahab. What does she get in return? All right. She and everybody in her house are spared from the destruction that's coming. Why does she ask for that? Yeah, you look in Joshua chapter 2, verse 8. Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said, I know that Yahweh has given you the land, that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. Why are they so scared? Well, how do they know the name of Yahweh? It's the next verse, right? How do they know? Because of the events that happened 40 years before, right? We heard how Yahweh dried up the water of the Red Sea before you, and when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction, utterly destroyed. It's an interesting phrase. So those were the ones up here that they conquered. Yeah, these people, there's a reputation following them, and it's not about the people, it's about whom? It's about Yahweh, their God. They say, we know this name. Remember early in Exodus, when all of these things were done so that my name would be known, that you will know my name, that the Egyptians will know my name, so the people will know my name. That's exactly what's happened. God has demonstrated who he is in such a way that people are trembling. 40 years later, they're still scared of this God. Well, we know that this is the time that God says, all right, we're going to do this. He has them cross over the Jordan River. And what time of the year are they crossing over the Jordan River? All right, during the flood stage. Very good, Lucy. So, first of all, why might not that, let me try that again. Why might that not be a very good time to cross the river if you're about to engage in a military campaign? Okay, slow you down. It's going to make it very difficult to get across, right? Why else? What happens when you get across? Okay, but what else? All right. What if things don't go well? Well, not necessarily. But what if you get in battle and things don't go well for you? You've got nowhere to run. This is a full, complete, total rout at this point. Militarily speaking, this is about the dumbest time to try to engage in some kind of attack on the city of Jericho. Normally, the waters would be low enough that you would at least maybe have a chance. Doing it during the flood stages, that's just stupid. I mean, that's what it boils down to. This is a horrible idea for them to engage in going across the river at the highest water level possible. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? And not only do they do that, but, as was pointed out, it's going to be really difficult to get across, isn't it? Has Israel ever been in a situation where they have to cross a body of water that's difficult to get across? Oh, they have, haven't they? How'd they get across that time? Oh, on dry ground, wasn't it? Yeah. So what's going to happen here then? Maybe the same thing, right? It's a little bit different in the way that it was. Remember before it was a wind that came through and it separated out the waters. Here, the river is stopped up, up current, up a little ways, so that they are able to then cross on dry ground. It's very similar to what was done before. Why would God need to do this again? What's that, Lorraine? Yeah, because Israel's a bunch of people who did not cross the Red Sea on dry ground. Most of them are dead in the wilderness, right? And so God is demonstrating, he's using the exact same demonstration for a new generation of people, the same reason that he gave a retelling of the law again to a new generation. Now a new generation gets to experience going across an impossible body of water on dry ground. And they commemorate it. They bring stones from the riverbed to demonstrate that, yes, this was dry when we took out stones that were so big we had to carry them on our shoulders. These types of stones, and they bring them out and they set them up into a commemoration of this event. This is now for them their Red Sea crossing. This is now their Jordan crossing. And sets up camp real close over here at a place called Gilgal. And at this point, they are now ready to engage in battle. So the first thing to do when you are ready to engage in battle is to what? Chapter 5. What's the first thing that you want to do when you're ready to engage in battle? Anybody? Yeah, what do they do? What are they told to do at this point? All right, all the people who haven't been circumcised over the last 40 years while you've been wandering, yeah, it's time to take care of that. Circumcision Day. Now, if you remember, back in Genesis, we kind of mentioned it, the story with the prince who was enamored with Dinah, that is one of Jacob's children, his daughter, and we'll just say, for the sake of many in the audience here, that he took advantage of the situation in an inappropriate way, asked for her hand in marriage because he was still enamored with her, and was granted on what condition? That Reuben and Simeon, at least it seems, came up with. They say, we're not going to let our sister marry into a bunch of people who haven't been circumcised. So if you will agree to circumcision, and everyone in your town agree to circumcision, then we will allow this marriage to take place. 3 days later, what did Reuben and Simeon do? No, I'm sorry, Simeon and Levi, not Reuben. Simeon and Levi, what did they do? You don't know? Okay, that's fair. They walked into the town, and they killed every single one of the men who were unable to defend themselves because of the pain of the circumcision. 3 days later. Now, if you are putting together a great military campaign and you've got all your fighting men, the most important thing that you want to make sure of is that you get them all circumcised in full plain view of the city that you're about to conquer, right? In fact, let's make sure that we put ourselves across a river at its high flood stage so that it's at our back, and then let's make our entire army completely powerless for at least 3 days. That sounds like pretty smart military tactics, doesn't it? Wouldn't it have been better, maybe, I don't know, if you wanted to do that over here on the plains of Moab? Let's take care of it, let's let them recover, and then we're going to cross this body of water that's behind us and makes it to where we have no escape. That would make a whole lot more sense, wouldn't it? Yeah?
Something odd. They stayed inside the city walls. They didn't come out during that 2-day period. That's kind of stupid, too.
You're talking about the folks?
Guys, the bad guys, yeah.
Yeah, they do. They never become antagonistic. You know, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fear of Yahweh. And we'll talk about that, you know, as we move forward here. So if I don't bring it up again, bring that up again. Once they're circumcised and they recover, now it's time to lay out the great battle plans, right? And that begins with what? Well, not yet. We're still in chapter 5, verse 10. Oh, yeah. By the way, there's the Passover. Now that we've got this body of water behind us, We've gone through the circumcision thing. Let's go ahead and celebrate the Passover, and let's have a feast, and followed by the 7 days of unleavened bread and everything. Let's do all of that right here in this place while we are in full view of the city. At any moment, as John says, they could come out and they could attack, and we won't be ready because we're doing the Passover. Again, if I'm not saying the Passover should not have been celebrated, but wouldn't it make a whole lot more sense to take care of circumcision and the Passover on the plains of Moab? Take care of all of that type of stuff and then cross over? I mean, it just, this is not the type of stuff that General Patton's going to draw up, right? I mean, we get that, right? Yeah, Jan was talking about how, because we don't have a runner with the mic tonight, Jan was talking about how Rahab has mentioned to the spies they are without courage. And this goes to what John was saying just a second ago. Then hold the thought for just a moment about why they don't come out, why they don't attack, as the case is, because they are not doing that. And God is very specifically doing things in, I think, absolutely horrible military strategy. It makes zero sense. You know, if this is not going to be drawn up by any of the great military minds of history. Napoleon is not going to say, hey guys, let's stop here right before this battle and let's all be circumcised. It's not something that would be done. But then we get to the grand strategy. Now we're ready. And what is that grand strategy? John said it a minute ago. What's their grand strategy for victory? Take a walk. He's like, all right, here's what we're going to do. On the first day, y'all, as a people, you're finally going to approach the city. And you're going to come up, and then you're going to go all the way around it, and then you're going to come home. All right. Again, this is not going to go down in the annals of military strategy, right? He says, but the second day. Now that second day, you're going to go out. And you're going to go all the way around the city, and then you're going to come back. But on the third day, you're going to go out. And you're going to go all the way around the city, and then you're going to come back. And you do that, right, for 6 days, and then what do? All right, then on the seventh day you come out, and what do? It's different this time, because this time you're going to walk around the city, and then you're going to keep going. See, it changed. You're going to do it 7 times, and at the end of 7 times, then what do? You scream, you yell, you blow the trumpets, right? And there it is. That's your military strategy. One of the most formidable cities that they are going to encounter, God says, here's your strategy. Walk around it and then yell. Yeah. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I think that's exactly the point. If this had been done because of great military strategy, if God had said, hey, here's how to build a good siege engine, or tower ladders, or whatever to get around the walls. Here's how to do this. Here's how to do that. Here's the proper way to go stealth at night and repel the walls. Or if he'd had them do something like that, they could have said what? Look what we did. God said, I'm going to make you do just about some of the stupidest things that you could possibly do in front of a victory or in front of a military campaign, and what's going to be the end result? Yeah, Jericho is going to get destroyed. Absolute, complete, 100% victory, and there's not a single Israelite that's going to say, oh yeah, that's because of me, right? They're going to know from the very beginning, this is Yahweh's work. And you talked about it, Jan brought it up. Why don't these people ever come out and attack? Why don't they ever, during this time that they are there and they go through circumcision and the Passover, they're vulnerable. Why don't the people ever attack? We've already said it, so. Because they're scared to death of Yahweh. It's fear. This is exactly what God had said was going to happen. The fear of the people. And it's almost like God is toying with them. It's like a cat playing with a little mouse. He's like, you're not going to do anything. I can do anything that I want right here. You want to see what I can do, and you're not going to come out and do anything? I'm going to have my entire army circumcised. No? Hey, let's celebrate the Passover. I can do anything that I want to, and it doesn't matter. Because you won't come out. You know not to. This is a message for the people, as Jan said, for the people of Israel to see and to understand. This is a land that God is giving to them. 100%. And they go, they march around. What happens? We all know this story, right? Then the walls, right? Came tumbling down. Yeah, the wall. Yeah, y'all know that song? Okay, just making sure. I was like, I don't remember singing that song here yet. Anyway, yeah, the walls came tumbling down, and they go in, and they utterly destroy the city. However, there were certain things that they were supposed to leave in the city. What are those types of things? Okay, things that the way it's described, things that are under the ban, things that are valuable, silver, gold, clothing, things like that. This wasn't a city that they were supposed to go in and plunder. In fact, what did they do with the city after they had defeated it? What did they do with it? They burned it. Set it on fire. Why'd they do that? You realize that there were only supposed to have been 2, but there were 3 cities that they end up burning. All the other cities do not get burned throughout this area. And a lot of people have been skeptical that Israel actually conquered the land because they say, look, we go to all these different cities and there's no layer of burn during this time that shows there's a conquest. And we would say, well, yeah, because they didn't do that with every city. But why did they do it with Jericho? They left everything valuable inside the city, and then they burned it. What does that sound like? Sounds like a sacrifice, doesn't it? This is a first fruits offering. That the first one is God's, and they set it on fire, and it is a sacrifice of everything that is valuable in there. They're going to have one more that I think they're supposed to burn at the very end. And you have a first and a last, and that one is the city of Hatzor, which we'll just very briefly mention later. But there's going to be a third city that they're going to burn that I don't think was initially what they were supposed to have done. And what is that city? All right, the city of Ai. So you have Ai, which is roughly around in there, that area. Ai and I think Bethel are real close to one another. And after this great military victory that takes place here, it should be easy. I mean, if the people of Jericho are that scared of Israel, just about anybody would be. Joshua just sends kind of a smaller force and says, all right, go get the next town. And what happens? Y'all know the story. What happens? They're defeated. That's not part of the script. In fact, I think this is the moment that drastically changes Israel's future. This is the moment where something happens that breaks the spell. You know, everybody in Jericho, they were terrified, deathly terrified of these people and their God. They knew they could not stand up against them. And yet, God and that people go to the city of Ai, and what happens? This tiny little town of Ai is able to stand up to them? Well, if they can, anybody can, right? And it changes, I think, the course. It was not supposed to be this way. What happened? There was sin in the camp. All right? We know the story of the guy, Achan, was back here. He was in Jericho fighting, saw some stuff, saw some money and some clothing that looked really good. Thought, well, you know, in the chaos, no big deal. I'll just pick it up, no one will see. And he hid it inside his own tent. So he, his family, everybody, you know, they knew about this and thought, we'll be fine. Were they? No. Because he had taken away from God's sacrifice. And that's something that is very, very displeasing. And so God says, well, I'm not going to be with you. They go up and fight against Ai without Yahweh, and they're defeated. So then they figure out what's going on. They cast lots, and the lot falls to Achan, and they say, hey, what happened? And at least he mans up here. He's not, you know, trying to pull an Adam and saying, well, it's such and such fault. Or he's like, hey, this is what I did. I saw these things, I took them, I hid them in the tent. You can go. They went, they found them, brought it back, and they said, you have brought trouble on Israel. I didn't look at that list. Is this something someone's talking about? On our summer series, the Valley of Achor? I didn't look. Oh, okay. Well, here we go. The Valley of Achor, he says, you have brought trouble on the people of Israel. And so they stoned him, his family, everything, you know, all that was his. And in the valley, they heaped stones upon him, which is going to be a symbol of separation from that which is sinful and wrong. This idea of heaping stones upon the bad guy. And they changed the name of the valley to the Valley of Achor, which means the Valley of Trouble, because of all the trouble that Achan brought on the people of Israel. They've eradicated the sin. Now they go back to the city of Ai. And this is where you start to see maybe some good military strategy, right? At this point, they come back, and they have a smaller force come in again, just like they did before. And now the people who've done it once in Ai, what do they assume? They can do it again. So they take flight after that small force, while the main force comes up around behind and takes the city without, the fighters there, and sets it on fire. Again, I don't think that was the original plan. I think Ai was supposed to give in. God was going to give them cities, houses that they did not build, vineyards that they did not plant. And they could have waltzed there, and I would have said, we surrender. We've seen what you've done. We've seen what you've done against Jericho. but God was not with them. And now it emboldened, what happens at Ai is now going to embolden everybody else. And they're going to fight battles that I believe they previously would not have had to have fought. Or at least it wouldn't have gone the way that it will. So they take Ai, and at this point there's a group of people around in here who kind of see the writing on the wall. They're like, well, they're coming this way. We don't want to stand in their way, so what are they going to do? Who were these people? Anybody remember? All right, these are the Gibeonites. And the Gibeonites, remember, they said, well, why don't we dress a few people up, put them in some old raggedy clothing. We're going to give them some wineskins that are old and cracking, and some bread that's nice and crumbly. Why? Well, okay, feel sorry for him. Kathy, what were you going to say? Yeah. Yeah, they wanted the Israelites to think that they'd come from a long ways away, and they come up and they're like, man, we're traveling through this land. And Joshua, we've been traveling from a long distance. Look at our clothing. Look at our wineskins. Look at our bread. Obviously, we've come from a long ways away. It's kind of obvious, isn't it? I mean, just how much they're going through this, but it works. Joshua listens to them and says, okay, well, we will help you, because their whole thing, they say to him, we're scared of the inhabitants of this land. We're sojourners from far away. We've entered into this land, and we're scared of them. If only there were someone who could help us. Was there anybody who was willing to help them? Joshua says, hey, you know what? We're foreigners in this land too. In fact, we're here to whoop up on all those folks you're scared of. Sure, we'll protect you. We'll take care of you. What's the problem in chapter 9? Maybe around verse 14. Yeah, John just said it, verse 14. The men took some of their provisions, but they did not ask counsel from the Lord. They were very specifically told, do not make any pacts, covenants, agreements with the people of the land. What's Joshua do? He makes a covenant with the people of the land in strict violation of what he was told. But once it's found out, though, that he was tricked, I mean, he's allowed to then at that point say, okay, hold on. I didn't make a covenant with you. I made a covenant with strangers. You tricked me. Therefore, this is null and void, right? I mean, if you were tricked, that means you don't have to uphold your end of it, right? Not according to God. You give your word is binding. It's so binding, in fact, that you fast forward to the days of David. And in the days of David, God says, hey, I'm going to bring about a penalty upon the land, a plague. I'm going to bring a plague upon the land because of what Saul did to the people of Gibeon, the Gibeonites, and that he did not honor the pact that Joshua had made. All right, now, we're talking a good number of years, right? Especially if we're at 1400 or so, at this point, the time of the conquest, around 1400, and Saul is the king around roughly 1040 or so. We're roughly 400-year difference, and God says, oh, that pact still stands. You are still bound by the word that you gave. Even in treachery, you give your word, then you fulfill your word. You don't have the right to just simply back out of it. So they make this pact here with these peoples, And the folks down here in the southern region, they find out about it. And they say, well, we are going to attack the Gibeonites and wipe them out before they have a real chance to join with and become a part of the Israelites. So that's what they do. They attack the Gibeonites. They, all join together, allied together to attack the Gibeonites. They send word to Joshua, and Joshua, like through the night, force marches his army and arrives in time to surprise the alliance of the kings of the south, and they engage in a battle. And it's going fairly well. The problem, though, is that they're running out of time at this point. So what does Joshua do? What's he ask for? Okay, Lucy said for God to hold the sun in place. He asked for more time, that the sun would stand still. And what happens? The sun stands still. And just think of the crazy ramifications of that. I mean, we have a better understanding of everything that means. And so understanding that the sun, time stops. And they're able to continue. And then God jumps into the fight with hailstones and stuff where he did more damage than the army was doing. And he comes and he fights. And then they finally catch the kings in a cave. And they then are victorious over all of the armies in the south. Up here, this is where the folks up here, and I think Hatzor is about right there. I could be wrong on that. I may have it too far north. But there's a coalition of armies up here, and they come up and they fight against the city of Hatzor there in the north, and they are victorious. This is the other city that they burn, where it is given over to God. Devoted to destruction, whatever the case is, they burn this city. Again, I think the picture, the point is it's a sacrifice. The city becomes a sacrifice that is given over to God. At this point, they have basically taken care of the center, the southern, the northern parts of Israel. They're done, right? What have they accomplished? They've defeated armies, right? They've defeated some kings. What have they not accomplished? All right, the people still live in their houses. The people still live in their cities. The people still live their daily lives. All they've done is defeated the armies, but the people still live in the land, and they still need to drive out the inhabitants. So at this point, Joshua separates up the land for all of the tribes, tells them what their allotted pieces are that they are supposed to go and conquer. And then next week, we will begin to look at the victorious way that Israel conquers the land and finally becomes a beacon of light for the people of God. That was all said tongue-in-cheek. Questions or comments from Joshua? Joe?
I was just thinking about when you were talking about Jericho and how the people did what God, they followed through on the instructions that God told them to. And they relied on God, and the victory belonged to God. And God showed them his power, and the instructions that God gave them was
Yeah, very good. Joe brought up the contrast between the taking of Jericho and the people who did exactly as the Lord said, even though it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Yet they do so by faith, and it's an overwhelming victory. But then you have the one, just a single individual, who does not obey, and the plundering of Jericho, and causes so many of the problems at Ai. And so you have a strong contrast over the way that people do exactly what God says, and what happens even if there's just one. Sometimes even just one person who goes against God is going to bring about consequences felt by the whole. The entire community suffers when one goes off and does his own way against God. And so you see that taking place. All right, very good. Yes, Lorraine.
There's two things. The day after they celebrated Passover,
Mm-hmm.
the manna stopped.
Yeah. Yes.
Bread from heaven. So they had to get their own food.
Yeah. Lorraine points out that as they come across here, and as they are here before they take Jericho, the manna that God has been providing for them ceases. So at this point, it becomes very important. They're going to start living off the land at this point, and they need to take all of these places so that they can. All right, you said you had one more.
And then before the Gibeonites come, Joshua takes the entire nation of Israel to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim
Mhm.
and reads the law,
Yep.
the blessings and the curses, as Moses had said.
Yep, and that was one of the things I just skipped over. But yeah, you have the reading of the blessing, the curses, and we don't have a whole, we're over time anyway. But it is really cool. There was recently, it needs to be run through 50 different peer check reviews and things, but they believe that they might have even found a curse on one of those that would date back to around this time that might have been part of what was read. And so there's a whole lot that needs to happen before we can celebrate and say it definitely is, because sometimes hoaxes happen. But it is really neat. All right, very good. Thanks a lot, guys. Good discussion. We're going to pick up with Judges next week. So that's what we will do. All right, thanks, guys.